I'm going to tell you a story. There's a story in Genesis. It's the last story in Genesis. It's called the Tower of Babel. It's a story, very short story, and it occurs after the story of Noah and the flood. The flood stories, by the way, are universally distributed except among desert dwellers who have no experience on which to hang the story. And Mircea Eliade, who wrote a great series of books called A History of Religious Ideas, documented the central narrative structure of flood stories. And so what happens is that there's a human settlement and it's washed away by a flood, and the flood is generally envisioned as a consequence of God's judgment. And so if you take the flood stories that are distributed worldwide and you boil them down to pull out their archetypal substructure, you find that there are fundamentally two reasons that a flood occurs. And Eliade says that it's the tendency of things to fall apart combined with the proclivity of human beings to sin. And so it means something. This means something. And so it means that everything is subject to entropic decay, right? Things fall apart of their own accord across time. That's why you have to always fix things. So if it's complicated, it has to be maintained. And so you can think about that in relationship to, say, New Orleans before the hurricane. Because people say, well, the hurricane caused a flood and that destroyed much of New Orleans. And so that's an act of God. That's one way of looking at it, right? It's a random natural event. But then you think, well, wait a minute. The Dutch, their country's mostly underwater, right? So they have these huge dikes to keep the sea back, and they build the dikes so that only one storm every 10,000 years will be of sufficient magnitude to partially breach the dikes. That's their engineering tolerance level, one storm in every 10,000 years. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers knew that the dikes in New Orleans were built to withstand one storm every 100 years, the biggest storm every 100 years. And people knew that they weren't built to proper tolerance, and much of the money that was hypothetically supposed to be diverted or assigned to the rebuilding and maintenance of the dikes disappeared because of corruption in New Orleans, which is in one of the most corrupt states in the United States. And so you might say, well, why did the flood destroy New Orleans? And one answer is, well, it was a hurricane, and the other answer is, no, it was corrupt officials who weren't paying attention to what they were supposed to be paying attention to. And the flood came, and that's the meaning of the stories, because of the sins of men, so to speak, which is the capacity of people to turn a blind eye to their responsibilities when they know perfectly well that something needs to be done. And so if you don't do what needs to be done and something comes along to wipe you out, then it's perfectly reasonable to view that as a judgment on your refusal to do what you knew to be right. So that's the flood story. And then the Tower of Babel is a very interesting story. It's very, very short. And what happens is that it just starts pretty much abruptly after the flood story ends. And it's a story about the decision that human beings take to build a mighty building, like a huge, huge edifice that would reach all the way up to the heavens to supplant God, roughly speaking. And so what happens is the building is built higher and higher and higher and higher, and God gets annoyed about this and divides everyone who's building the building into small groups who speak different languages, who then disperse, and the construction project comes to a halt. Now, it's a very strange story, but here's one way of thinking about it. The larger you build a system, the more there's a proclivity to worship it as if it's everything. That's the story of ideology, let's say. You want to build a comprehensive utopian system that supplants anything transcendent. You want to build it as large as possible so it encompasses everyone. Well, what happens as it grows? Well, it incorporates more and more people, but the people within it become more and more different from one another. And so essentially they start speaking different languages. And so the entire project of raising this massive edifice to supplant everything disperses into chaos and comes to a halt. Okay, so that's one story. So here's another story. This is a story that John Milton wrote. John Milton wrote Paradise Lost, which is one of the prime literary masterpieces of the last 500 years. Now, here's what Milton did. Milton said he was trying to justify the ways of God to man. That was his purpose. And so what he was trying to do was take a look at the world the way it's constituted, with all its suffering and malevolence and corruption, and to make a case why it was still acceptable. And so he did the first, what you might think about as psychoanalytic study of malevolence and evil. So around the corpus of biblical writings, there's an idea of heaven and hell, and they're not referred to much within the corpus of biblical writings, but there are what you might describe as legends that have compiled around them. So they're stories that never became canonical, and those are stories, for example, of the idea that God's highest angel, who was Satan, Lucifer, the bringer of light, the spirit of rationality, fomented a rebellion against God in heaven and was cast into hell as a consequence. And so there's this idea, Milton wrote this before the rise of the nation states, for example, and there's this idea that there's this tension between the political and ideological and rational constructions of the rational mind and the sort of transcendent mythology that guides human organization, and that Satan, as God's highest, as the highest angel in God's heavenly kingdom, is a personification of the tendency of the rational mind to produce totalitarian systems and then to fall in love with them. So to produce a system that encompasses everything, like the Tower of Babel, so that nothing outside the system is allowed to exist. Well, Milton's intuition, because he collected the stories about satanic rebellion that had been accumulating across centuries from far before Christianity was even constituted, turned this into a great poetic drama. And his hypothesis was that the element of the psyche, let's say, the spiritual element of the psyche that characterized the rational mind, would, by its proclivity to produce these totalizing systems, end up casting itself into hell. And so you could think about it as a prophetic visualization of what was going to come down the centuries after Milton wrote. Because the poets get there before the philosophers, the artists get there maybe before the poets, the philosophers follow in their wake. The poets are the people who have the visions of what's coming farthest down the road. So this is from Milton. This is describing Satan after he's cast into hell because of his rebellion, his totalitarian, the consequence of his totalitarian rationalism. For now the thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain torments him. Round he throws his baleful eyes that witnessed huge affliction and dismay mixed with obdurate pride and steadfast hate. At once, as far as angels can, he views the dismal situation, waste and wild, a dungeon horrible, on all sides round, as one great furnace flamed, yet from those flames no light, but rather darkness visible, served only to discover sights of woe, regions of sorrow, doleful shades where peace and rest can never dwell. Hope never comes that comes to all, but torture without end still urges, and a fiery deluge fed with ever-burning sulfur unconsumed. Such place eternal justice had prepared for those rebellious. Here their prison ordained, in utter darkness, and their portion set, as far removed from God and light of heaven as from the center thrice to the utmost pole. It's an existentialist claim, or maybe it's the existentialist claim, that the conditions of human life are such that suffering is an integral part of existence. Now, it's an important thing to understand. It's also a viewpoint shared by the bulk of the great religious systems of the world. Life is suffering. Why? Well, one reason is because of society's arbitrary judgment, right? Every single one of us has traits and features and quirks and idiosyncrasies that are far from ideal and that are judged by the standards of society as insufficient. And so you suffer because of your imperfect insufficiency in the eyes of others. And you can certainly make the claim that fairly frequently that's arbitrary. And so that's the claim that society is tyrannical and judgmental and needs to be constantly reconstituted so that the tyrannical element doesn't take full control. And fair enough, you have to stay awake so that that doesn't happen. But the thing is, it doesn't matter what society it is, although they vary in the degree of their tyranny. The mere fact that you're grouped together with other people and have to come up with a common value structure in order to live together means that many of the things that characterize you are going to be suboptimal. And so the price you pay for social being is that much of you is deemed insufficient. Now, hopefully there are various ways that you can be within a society that's sufficiently diverse so that you can find a place where what's good about you in the eyes of others and perhaps in your own eyes can flourish of its own accord. Because you don't have to be good at everything. If you can be good at one thing well enough, that might allow you your niche. And hopefully a healthy society allows for that. Certainly societies can become so tyrannical that they don't. So you can lay one source of human suffering at the feet of tyrannical social structures, but the other element of it, clearly, is the mere fact of the arbitrariness of the natural world. You have a lifespan that's going to be counted in the number of decades that you can count on two hands. And that has nothing to do, technically, with the tyranny of the social structure. Now you could say, if we got our act together more completely, perhaps you could live longer, and fair enough, but the fact of the limits of your lifespan and the suffering that's necessarily a consequence of that, the death of your parents and the death of most people that you will know before you, means that that part of suffering is an integral part of existence itself. And so that can't be laid at the feet of an insufficient social structure except insofar as it's tyrannical and blind. It's a condition of existence. And then by the same token, you have your own responsibility for some of your unnecessary suffering, because there's things you could be doing to make your life better and to make life better for other people that you know perfectly well that you're not doing. And so if you stopped doing all the unnecessary things that make your life bad, then it would improve to some degree that is not really computable, because you don't know how far you could push that. So there's three reasons why you suffer, and one is, well, look at you and the way you're built. It's inevitable. There's not very much of you and there's a lot of everything else. And so you just don't last that long, and you're fragile across multiple domains, and then you're harshly treated by society, and there's no doubt about that. And then there's responsibility that can be laid at your own feet. Well, the existential take on that, and the thing that all these diverse people that we've been talking about, including Viktor Frankl and including Alexander Solzhenitsyn, as well as Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, and Dostoevsky, and the people that I've already talked to you about, is that the proper pathway through that is to adopt the mode of authentic being. And that is something like refusing to participate in the lie, in deception and the lie, to orient your speech as much as you can towards the truth, and to take responsibility for your own life and perhaps also for the lives of other people. And there's something about that that's meaningful and responsible and noble, but also serves to mitigate the very suffering that produces, say, the nihilism or the flee into the arms of or the escape into the arms of totalitarians to begin with. You need something to shelter you against your own vulnerability. And you can adopt a comprehensive description of reality that's formulated for you by someone else that neatly divides the world into those who are innocent and perhaps innocent victims, and those who are guilty and perhaps the perpetrators of the suffering. But none of that has anything to do with you, and in addition, it's simply not a reasonable way of assessing the world. The suffering is built in. So that's why there's an existentialist insistence upon that, so that for the Freudians, the psychoanalysts, and even for people like Carl Rogers to some degree, if you're in a situation that's characterized by psychopathology, if there's something wrong with you mentally, that's a consequence of something gone wrong. But that's not the existentialist take. The existentialist take is, no, that's just how it is. That's just how it is. You don't have to necessarily have done anything wrong for things to get completely out of control. It's a terrifying doctrine, But it's not a hopeless doctrine because it still says that there's a way forward, there's a pathway forward. And the pathway forward is to adopt a mode of being that has some nobility so that you can tolerate yourself and perhaps even have some respect for yourself as someone who's capable of standing up in the face of that terrible vulnerability and suffering, and that the pathway forward, as far as the existentialists are concerned, is by, well, certainly by the avoidance of deceit, particularly in language, but also by the adoption of responsibility for the conditions of existence and some attempt on your part to actually rectify them. And the thing that's so interesting about that is, well, two, as far as I'm concerned, and some of this is from clinical experience. You know, if you take people, and I've told you this, and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, you know, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, you know, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, and another way that you could act in the world, so what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things, and I've told you already, I think before, that today, for example, about 250,000 people will be lifted out of abject poverty, and about 300,000 people attached to the electrical power grid. We're lifting people out of poverty collectively at a faster rate that's ever occurred in the history of humankind by a huge margin. And that's been going on unbelievably quickly since the year 2000. The UN had planned to have poverty between 2000 and 2015, and it was accomplished by 2013. So there's inequality developing in many places, and you hear lots of political agitation about that. But overall, the tide is lifting everyone up, and that's a great thing, and we have no idea how fast we could multiply that if people got their act together and really aimed at it. Because, you know, my experience is with people that we're probably running at about 51% of our capacity. I mean, you can think about this yourselves. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste, and the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. You know, inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You know, you think, well, that's 25 hours a week, it's 100 hours a month, that's 2.5 full work weeks, it's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? You'd be who knows how much more efficient, 10 times more efficient, 20 times more efficient. That's the Pareto distribution. You have no idea how efficient people get. It's off the charts. Well, and if we all got our act together collectively and stopped making things worse, because that's another thing people do all the time, not only do they not do what they should to make things better, they actively attempt to make things worse because they're spiteful or resentful or arrogant or deceitful or homicidal or genocidal, or all of those things all bundled together in an absolutely pathological package. If people stopped really, really trying just to make things worse, we have no idea how much better they would get just because of that. So there's this weird dynamic that's part of the existential system of ideas between human vulnerability, social judgment, both of which are major causes of suffering, and the failure of individuals to adopt the responsibility that they know they should adopt. And that's the thing that's interesting too, is that, and like another thing I've often asked my undergraduate classes is, you know, there's this idea that people have a conscience. And you know what the conscience is. It's this feeling or voice you have in your head just before you do something that you know is stupid, telling you that probably you shouldn't do that stupid thing. You don't have to listen to it, strangely enough, but you go ahead and do it anyways, and then of course exactly what the conscience told you was going to happen inevitably happens, so that you feel even stupider about it than you would if it happened by accident, because you know, I knew this was going to happen, I got a warning it was going to happen, and I went and did it anyways. And the funny thing too is that conscience operates within people, and we really don't understand what the hell that is. So you might say, well, what would happen if you abided by your conscience for 5 years or for 10 years? What sort of position might you be in? What sort of family might you have? What sort of relationship might you be able to forge? And you can be bloody sure that a relationship that's forged on the basis of who you actually are is going to be a lot stronger and more welcome than one that's forged on the basis of who you aren't. Now, of course, that means that the person you're with has to deal with the full force of you in all your ability and your catastrophe, and that's a very, very difficult thing to negotiate. But if you do negotiate it, well, at least you have something, you have somewhere solid to stand, and you have somewhere to live, you have a real life. And it's a great basis upon which to bring children into the world, for example, because you can have an actual relationship with them instead of torturing them half to death, which is what happens in a tremendously large minority of cases. Well, it's more than that too, because, and this is what I'll close with, and this is why I wanted to introduce Solzhenitsyn's writings to you. You see, because it isn't merely that your fate depends on whether or not you get your act together and to what degree you decide that you're going to live out your own genuine being. It isn't only your fate, it's the fate of everyone that you're networked with. And so, you know, you think, well, there's 9 billion, 7 billion people in the world. We're going to peak at about 9 billion, by the way, and then it'll decline rapidly, but 7 billion people in the world, and who are you? You're just one little dust mote among that 7 billion, and so it really doesn't matter what you do or don't do, but that's simply not the case. It's the wrong model, because you're at the center of a network. You're a node in a network. Of course, that's even more true now that we have social media. You'll know 1,000 people, at least over the course of your life. And they'll know 1,000 people each, and that puts you one person away from 1 million, and 2 persons away from 1 billion. And so that's how you're connected, and the things you do, they're like dropping a stone in a pond. The ripples move outward, and they affect things in ways that you can't fully comprehend, and it means that the things that you do and that you don't do are far more important than you think. And so if you act that way, of course, the terror of realizing that is that it actually starts to matter what you do. And you might say, well, that's better than living a meaningless existence. It's better for it to matter. But I mean, if you really asked yourself, would you be so sure if you had the choice? I can live with no responsibility whatsoever. The price I pay is that nothing matters. Or I can reverse it and everything matters. But I have to take the responsibility that's associated with that. It's not so obvious to me that people would take the meaningful path. You know, when you say, well, nihilists suffer dreadfully because there's no meaning in their life and they still suffer. Yeah, but the advantage is they have no responsibility. So that's the payoff, and I actually think that's the motivation. Say, well, I can't help being nihilistic. All my belief systems have collapsed. It's like, yeah, maybe. Maybe you've just allowed them to collapse because it's a hell of a lot easier than acting them out. And the price you pay is some meaningless suffering, but you can always whine about that and people will feel sorry for you, and you have the option of taking the pathway of the martyr, so that's a pretty good deal, all things considered, especially when the alternative is to bear your burden properly and to live forthrightly in the world. Well, what Solzhenitsyn figured out, and so many people in the 20th century, it's not just him, even though he's the best example, is that if you live a pathological life, you pathologize your society. And if enough people do that, then it's hell. Really, really. And you can read the Gulag Archipelago if you have the fortitude to do that, and you'll see exactly what hell is like. And then you can decide if that's a place you'd like to visit, or even more importantly, if it's a place you'd like to visit and take all your family and friends, because that's what happened in the 20th century.